the battles to what Fidel Castro commended us and asked for. These are the struggles that we are leading and that we are continue to give to the future. We have achieved a lot with his leadership, with his solidarity to our eternal commander Hugo Chavez, to whom we remember as well. We cannot speak of Fidel without speaking of Chavez at the same time, because together they built what no one thought was possible. As we were saying, when everyone had said the history was done. And very early in his personal life, we listened to Fidel, especially in that decade at the end of the 80s, the beginning of the 90s, when the initiatives, the patriotic and liberation initiatives were starting, and we were starting to understand, and also a dark veil was veiled, and they were trying to impose this idea that the peoples had been defeated and that liberalism was the only victorious option. And as we listened before, there was only one voice in the world that was able, even before this happened, to warn on what was happening, what was coming, and how we should deal with that situation. That, without a doubt, led a process in Venezuela of our Bolivarian revolution. Yesterday, President Nicolás Maduro narrated in the framework of the celebration his encounter, his early encounter with Commander Fidel Castro here in Caracas, when we were just 20 days, 25 days away from that event, that historical event, and regretful as well, of the Caracazo, February 27th, 28th, March 1st of 1989. Less than 1 month before of that, Fidel was here in Venezuela. And within the lies of the far right were the idea that Fidel had been here to mount and to contribute to that popular rebellion in our country, that he had been here in order to lead, to conspire for that rebellion with the popular movements that were part of that social explosion of the Caracazo. But what our President Nicolás Maduro was saying yesterday is that what Fidel saw in the eyes of the youth was what was coming for Venezuela. He identified that. He could perceive that in such a live way. That was his great capacity, extraordinary capacity that he had, the commander-in-chief, of being ahead of his time, of the event. And he saw even further down the road. And he knew, because we need to say it as well, from very early on, Commander-in-Chief Fidel Castro, even before the Cuban Revolution, they knew of the role of Venezuela in this liberation process in Latin America, because of its Bolivarian history, because of its geopolitical position, for its education, and the great deeds that happened in parallel to the Cuban Revolution in order to defeat the regime of Pérez Jiménez, that happened by revolutionary forces that were then betrayed by an elite that had been bought by Washington. Here is our comrade El Gallo from the Communist Party of Venezuela, who was here. He led the mobilization, the trade unions, the student movement, and farmers and agricultural movement. That was in the 50s. And that is why when the commander Fidel Castro came just days before, yesterday our ambassador Germán Sánchez Otero said when he came that was a revolution, because this was a revolutionary Venezuela that then had the role and was assigned the role of countering the Cuban Revolution, but that was an artificial role because the Venezuelan people was always part of that Cuban Revolution. 40 years later, when Fidel came to Caracas, he saw in the eyes of the youth, in the eyes of those who now are leading this revolution, President Nicolás Maduro, he saw in those eyes what was coming for Venezuela. But he also saw this in the rebellion of those young army men who in 92, as a consequence of that popular rebellion of 89, they raised in arms against that dictatorship, against that regime, that oppression regime, sellout government that had been installed here against the will, political will and spirit of the Venezuelan people. And we need to say this. In the continent, only in Venezuela we understood how that military force was really a force that was very much near the people. And the friends of the Latin American left, they had doubts and they hesitated because of the past of the military actions and dictatorships in the South specifically. They doubted Commander Chavez and that military youth. But once again, the commander, Fidel, he didn't hesitate for a second. President Maduro always said that one asked, what did Fidel say? What did Fidel think? In Venezuela, we always thought, what would Fidel think? And in that moment, Fidel traced the road, and he saw in that movement that was being born in the military youth, he was able to see and know what was coming and know what Commander Chavez meant and to move forward in a direction. That is why he received him just in the moment that he came out of prison in 1994. In an extraordinary manner, he appeared there right outside the plane, and he received Commander Chavez in that historical visit to Cuba that marked Welcome back to From the South. On August 13th, the Fidel Castro Ruz Center, the institution that is dedicated to shaping values, spreading thoughts, and studying the work of the Cuban leader, became the epicenter of activities for the 99th anniversary of his birth. These activities in the Cuban capital. Our correspondent in Havana, Fabiola Lopez, was there and tells us more.
This
is how the Fidel Castro Ruz Center awoke on August 13th. The celebration of the first 100 years with Fidel is just beginning, and children are the stars of the day. It is a different day, and it could not be any other way. Today is Fidel's birthday.
This is a bust presented to Fidel by Chinese President Xi Jinping in July 2014, but Fidel did not feel comfortable with it. However, he accepted it as a sign of friendship with the Chinese people. He didn't feel comfortable with it because he didn't want any statues or busts in his name or with his face on them.
They say that Fidel once said that while his enemies were talking about his post-Castro era, he was working towards that moment. The truth is that almost 10 years after his death, that is how Cuban children see and feel it.
His personality, his culture, he is good, he is kind. I am talking about him in present because even though he's dead to us, he never died. Even if you don't believe it, Fidel is always by our side teaching us and we are learning things about him. Even though he's no longer alive, he is morally in the hearts of all of the children.
And of course, on a day like this, we couldn't miss the performance by Fidel's favorite children's theater company, La Colmenita.
The thing I admire the most about him is his work, his thought, and that he was a great man.
On August 13 of this island, the man who changed the destiny of this part of the planet was born. 99 years later, those who know how to love, the hope of the world, celebrate his survival, in the words of Martin.
Fabiola López, teleSUR, La Habana.
We now begin with the information. In Russia, at least 13 people were injured in a Ukrainian drone attack on a residential area in the southern city of Rostov-on-Don on Thursday. As the Moscow-Washington summit approaches in Alaska, attacks by the Kiev army against civilian targets in residential areas are intensifying. According to the interim local governor, Yuri Slusar, several apartment buildings on two of the city's main streets were damaged in the strike. In the aftermath, the authority also informed that at least 2 of the wounded were in serious condition and were transferred to a medical center. In a similar event, 3 people were reported seriously injured after a drone strike in the city of Belgorod. We go now to Palestine as the death toll from Israel's genocide in Gaza now exceeds the 61,700 civilians killed, mostly women and children, while the number of wounded has reached the 154,000. In the last 24 hours, medical sources in the coastal enclave confirmed the death of 8 Palestinians, including 3 children, due to hunger and malnutrition caused by the Zionist regime's aid blockade. In addition, health authorities reported 21 civilians were killed in Israeli strikes and 1 body was recovered from the rubble, while 185 people were wounded and transferred to hospitals. Welcome back to From the South. We continue with more information. Peruvian President Dina Boluarte signed a law granting general amnesty to people investigated for crimes that were committed during Peru's internal armed conflict between the 1980s and 2000. The initiative would benefit members of the armed forces, police, and self-defense committees accused or under investigation for crimes committed during this period. Social movements and human rights organizations are denouncing that the legislation undermines decades of efforts to ensure accountability for atrocities that were committed during this armed conflict. In this regard, the text will be subject to unconstitutionality actions by various institutions and groups that consider it a threat to fundamental rights. Cuba and the world celebrated the legacy of the historical revolution leader Fidel Castro on his 99th birth anniversary. Fidel, born on August 13th in 1926 in Biran, which hosted the main commemorative acts in his honor. From there, authorities from the Cuban Communist Party highlighted the revolutionary leader's struggle against the imperialist interest of the United States and in favor of the people. Tributes to the revolutionary strategies took place across the world as he became a symbol of global resistance whose political and ideological legacy continues to guide Cuba's defense of sovereignty and independence. Also on Wednesday, President of Venezuela Nicolás Maduro received a Cuban delegation in Caracas as part of the celebrations for the 99th anniversary of Fidel Castro's birth. In his speech, President Maduro described the historic leader of the Cuban Revolution as a hurricane and a giant who changed the history of Latin America, the Caribbean, and much of the world. He assured that Fidel lives in our struggles, in our hearts, and is permanently present in everything that we do, and emphasized the importance of his ideas and leadership in the development of the new Latin American revolutions. Maduro also recalled the relationship between the Cuban leader and Hugo Chavez, whom Fidel recognized as the best friend that Cuba has ever had. And also in Colombia, citizens paid tribute to the Cuban leader in celebration of his 99th birthday. Citizens highlighted the legacy of Latin American integration, social justice, and anti-imperialism of Commander Fidel Castro Ruz in an event that reinforced the alliance between Cuba and Colombia. They also recalled the tireless struggle of the historical leader for a more just society. It is worth noting that Colombians also expressed their solidarity with the Cuban people following the aggressions of the United States and also condemned the genocidal actions